speak. Welcome to this wonderful evening that we have ahead of us. I'm Trenton Carls, the Executive Director of the Lexington History Museums. I see many familiar faces in the crowd, so many of you know who we are, but for those of you who don't, I have a quick blurb that I'd like to share with you. We just updated our website, so we have new, fresh language. The Lexington History Museums brings Lexington's globally significant history to life for locals and travelers alike. Through exhibitions and interpretations of three fascinating historic sites: Buckman Tavern, Monroe Tavern, and the Hancock Clark House, where significant events of the Revolutionary War unfolded, as well as the Lexington Depot, a renovated 19th century train station, which showcases all of Lexington's history throughout time. Our extensive collections from over 300 years of Lexington history include documents, artwork, furniture, and textiles, which are all available to researchers through simply contacting our curator, Jesse Hilton. We also host many great events like the one you're present for this evening. Up next for us, we have our bi-monthly book chat, where author Stephen Knott will be joining us via Zoom to discuss his book, Washington and Hamilton, The Alliance That Forged America. That's on December 2nd, 7 p.m. at said depot. Then on Thursday, December 4th, it'll be a busy evening throughout town, as that's the Taste of Lexington. And you should definitely stop by Buckman Tavern, where our shop will have lots of great discounts and deals, as well as a pomander workshop. And that same night at Monroe Tavern, just down the street, we will have a closing reception and gallery talk with photographer Steve Edson on his excellent images showing modern-day depictions of revolutionary landmarks in a modern landscape. And of course, to close out the year, we have our annual Lexington tea burning reenactment just outside of Buckman Tavern. The event is being marked as a signature event for Lex 250, so it should be a lot of fun. We are very excited to have Joel here tonight, particularly as he is fresh off a standing room only presentation at the New England Museum Association Conference, where he presented with Bob Bellinger and our very own, again, curator Jesse Hilton on the strengths and benefits of collaborative and unique research methods in forensic and archival settings. And on the topic of collaboration, we are so grateful and thrilled to be co-hosting this presentation this evening with our friends at the Scottish Rite Masonic Museum and Library. We thank them for hosting us in this beautiful space and for their integral roles in the planning and execution of this great evening. So thank you. And with that, I would like to turn things over to their Executive Director, Richard Elliott. Thank you.
Thank you, Trenton. Well, good evening. My name is Rich Elliott, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Scottish Rite Masonic Museum and Library. And we welcome all of you here this evening, whether you're attending in person or those that might be viewing on the live stream. We're once again grateful to be able to share the presentation this evening through the generous services of our local community access partner, LexMedia. And we are excited to bring you this opportunity as part of our 50th anniversary programming and in partnership with the Lexington History Museums. Tonight, we are pleased to have here with us Joel Bohy. Joel is a military historian and a great asset to the Antiques Roadshow that I think we're probably all familiar with. Joel has an enduring passion for the material culture related to military history. Grew up in Concord, spent about 50 years in Concord, Massachusetts, and began collecting at an early age and developed a passion for the arms, equipage, and uniforms of the common soldier from the American Revolutionary War through World War II. He is an active member of the American Society of Arms Collectors and an instructor for advanced metal detecting for the archaeologist. His passion for militaria has led him to write and lecture with the Society for Historical Archaeology, Fields of Conflict Archaeology Conference, Colonial Williamsburg Weapons of War Conference, Concord Museum, and the Minuteman National Historical Park. Joel and co-author Douglas Scott have conducted years of forensic research on the surviving bullet holes and bullet-struck artifacts from the battles of Lexington and Concord, which ignited the Revolutionary War, carrying out rigorous scientific experiments, which included the firing of custom-built reproduction colonial and British firearms from the Revolutionary War. They have generated data that has allowed them to reconstruct troop positions and movements all along Battle Road. Their motivation was to discover details of the various encounters and to share the related stories. The culmination of this research is the newly released Bullet Strikes from the First Day of the American Revolution, which uses engaging imagery, first-person accounts from the battles, and the historical and archaeological expertise of both of the authors to illustrate the stories these witnessed objects can tell and the empathy they can inspire for the events of April 19, 1775. Tonight's lecture will take a closer look at three individuals involved at the beginning of the war: John Robbins of Lexington, who was badly wounded on April 19th, James Hayward of Acton, who was mortally wounded at Fiske Hill in Lexington, and a British soldier who was also wounded in Lexington on April 19th and went on to join the Lexington militia in the Continental Army. Please welcome Joe Bohy.
Thank you guys for coming. Tonight's going to be a little bit different. A lot of the talks that I've been giving recently have been about bullet-struck objects, structures, the door panel at Buckman Tavern, and Jason Russell House. Don't want to leave out Arlington here. But tonight we're going to talk about, originally the talk was going to be about three men and how their wounds affected their life, or information about how those men who were wounded or killed. But I had enough time and I found out some new information recently, so I added a fourth guy. And it's really interesting stuff. I will tell you that some of what we're going to see here involves some of our ballistics research. Like John Robbins, I'm going to show a video where we recreated the wound, so I will tell you that that is a little bit graphic. But I think it's important that we see that to better understand that, April 19th for us is an important event. We have parades, we have bunting up on our homes. Get really excited about it every year. I know as a kid, April 18th, I didn't sleep at night. I sat up all night with my little musket and tri-cornered hat on, just waiting for dawn so I could go to Lexington and go to the Green. But we have to remember that it was a war and that a lot of people were killed and a lot of people were wounded so badly that it affected the rest of their lives. As a kid, I remember going to my mom in Concord, and I wanted to buy a musket. It was my first musket, and I was 14 years old. And I went to my mother all excited, but I was a little bit scared. And she's like, "Joel, I don't want any guns in the house." And I said, "But Mom, it's a musket." And she went, "Oh, okay." And I went to say something. I almost shot myself in the foot, so to speak, to go, "Well, wait a minute." But I said, no, I don't want to say anything because I really want this musket. But what we're going to see here is some of these guys and some great stories that go along with it. Now, hopefully, you'll be able to see what's on the screen. For some reason, it got a little bit blurry on the big screen. But we're going to start with John Robbins. And this particular guy, I've been going through Mass Archives for 10 years and going through every slip of paper in the archives and making folders on people. And it's like, oh, John Robbins, I know that name. And I kept putting the stuff in folders. And then all of a sudden I realized with John Robbins, I had about 30 documents. And there was a lot of information there where before they were just names on a page. We have John Robbins at the top, John Tidd, we know a little bit about what happened to him. There's some others here, Daniel Hemingway from Framingham, I've got a lot on him. Prince Estabrook, we don't have a whole lot on, but it's great when you can start to compile a bunch of data on one person. So what do we know about John Robbins? He was born supposedly in Charlestown, although another site says Lexington. Again, during this time period, it's really hard to get clear information on some of these people. He married Sarah Prentice of Cambridge in 1761. On April 19th, he was 37 years old. And on April 19th, he had 5 children, all below the age of 13 years old. He had another child in March of 1778. On June 5th, 1759, John Robbins received a bayonet. In 1758, Massachusetts added an addendum to their Militia Act where half of every foot company had to have a bayonet. So this is Lexington's list I found at Mass Archives, and you can see the red arrow is where John Robbins received his bayonet. There's a bunch of other folks who fought on Lexington Green also that are on that list. We know on April 19th, John Robbins left a deposition on what happened to him, and to make it a little bit easier, I transcribed it. I, John Robbins, being of lawful age, do testify and say that on the 19th instant, the company under the command of Captain John Parker, being drawn up sometime before sunrise on the green or common, and I being in the front rank, that's important, there suddenly appeared a number of the king's troops, about 1,000, as I thought, at the distance of about 60 or 70 yards from us, huzzaing and on a quick pace towards us, with 3 officers in their front on horseback and on full gallops towards us, the foremost of which cried, "Throw down your arms, ye villains, ye rebels," upon which said company dispersing, the foremost of the 3 officers ordered their men, saying, "Fire, by God, fire." At which moment we received a very heavy close fire from them, at which instant, being wounded, I fell, and several of our men were shot dead by me, standing near him. Captain Parker's men, I believe, had not fired a gun, and further the deponent saith not. So we know he was in the front rank. And we know from Captain Parker's deposition that he ordered the men to disperse. So we'll get a little more into that in a minute. Now, after April 19th and the Battle of Bunker Hill, there were obviously a bunch of folks who were wounded, but there were also a bunch of folks who lost arms and equipment. In Massachusetts, as they had done in every war before, if you lost something, you could petition the colony for it, the province for it, and they would pay you, but you had to have letters from your officers that basically, corroborated that information. So it wasn't set up for wounds at first, but then they started to allow the wounds. And the first deposition from John Robbins is here, November 11th, 1775. And in the House of Representatives, resolved that there be given to and paid out of the public treasury of this colony to John Robbins the sum of 23 pounds, 17 shillings, and 8 pence in full for his loss of time and expense to doctors, nurses, occasioned by his being wounded in the Lexington battle. So this is one of the earliest petitions for anybody who was wounded. There are arms petitions that come in around the same time, but this is the earliest one that I found for wounds. In 1776, he put in another petition, and it's very descriptive because we can see how he was wounded. It says, "The petition of John Robbins of Lexington humbly showeth that your petitioner was on the memorable 19th of April, 1775, most grievously wounded by the British troops in Lexington by a musket ball which passed by the left of the spine between his shoulders through the length of his neck, making its way through and most miserably shattering his under jawbone, by which unhappy wound your petitioner is so much hurted in the muscles of his shoulder that his right arm is rendered almost useless to him in his business, and by the fracture of his underjaw, the power of mastication is totally destroyed. And by his low slop diet, his situation is rendered truly pitiable, being unable to contribute anything to the support of a wife and 5 small children, but is rather a burden upon them, and has no encouragement from his surgeon of his being materially better." So this petition says the bullet went through his left shoulder, went up through his neck, and came out of his mouth. And it's amazing that he actually survived this. So because of that, he was awarded 13 pounds and 6 shillings a year for his pension, which really, when you think about it, is not a lot of money for losing his lower jaw and not being able to eat again and move his arm. In 77, he also put in for a pension payment, and this one was paid out to Deacon Jonathan Stone for the use of John Robbins of Lexington, a pensioner, for his year's pension till April 19th, 1777. So this is actually the payment receipt for that pension. In 78, his pension came along with a note from his doctor, Dr. Marshall Spring of Watertown. And it wrote, "To the Honorable Council of the State of Massachusetts Bay, this certificate humbly showeth that the bearer, Mr. John Robbins of Lexington, received such a grievous wound through the muscles of his right shoulder, neck, and jawbone, which last was miserably fractured, by which wound the unhappy man is yet so debilitated in his right shoulder that he is unable to perform but very little labor, as fatigue upon his small farm for the support of a numerous family of his young children. And in the opinion of the subscriber, who was his surgeon, he is unhappily like to remain in such a weakened, hopeless condition during life, and is a proper object of the gracious bounty of this state. And then he wrote, as if they didn't know, he was wounded on the morning of April 19th at Lexington. So it talks about here his right shoulder as opposed to his left shoulder. In 1779, again, he puts in a petition for payment, which is basically worded as the one in 1776 was. 1780, same thing. This one looks like it was actually written by him. I think the others were not. But he's basically stating the same thing every year, that how badly wounded he was, and that the wounds were still weeping. In 1783, it was resolved that you could apply for a pension with the colony. And it was put into the newspapers, and it was stated that all those persons in this Commonwealth who have been wounded at any period during the late war and who are entitled to a pension from the government as a compensation thereof, by any resolve of the General Court, heretofore passed, to be directed to report themselves and make known their circumstances. So they had to go be inspected, basically, by a guy named John Lucas. And in 1786, I found this at Mass Archives. This is the pension listing that John Lucas wrote for John Robbins, that he was an inhabitant of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts who belonged to the Massachusetts Regiment of Militia, commanded by Colonel Thomas Brattle, and in Captain John Parker's company in the services of the United States of America. He was aged 48 in 1786. Appears by certificate lodged in the pension office, having been examined by me, is found to be disabled in the said service by a musket ball in his right shoulder and in his right cheek. And I do hereby certify that he is entitled to receive 20 shillings per month, commencing 17 March 1786, agreeable to the resolution of Congress of the 7th of June 1785. So they decided that he would be able to get his pension. However, he is now fit for garrison duty. So even though he can't eat, he can't move his right arm, he can still do garrison duty. And he appears on this, in this newspaper article, as, on the second one from the top, as someone who can do garrison duty, and that was by John Lucas, who is on the bottom of this page also. But these guys, a lot of them, when you look at how they were wounded, I don't understand how they could actually do garrison duty, but that wasn't my decision, obviously. So after the garrison duty list, there's nothing else. We don't know when he died, possibly 1791. No record of when his wife died. We know that obviously he was very poor. His daughter Sarah died in 1837, and her probate states that she lived in the Scotland area of Lexington, probably over near Monroe Tavern somewhere. And there's no burial records. I've gone through all the Lexington archives, and there's no burial records for them at all that survive, so we don't even know whether they're buried, or where they're buried. So now that we've talked about what we know about him, we have to talk about the guns that were being used on Lexington Green that morning. The British, we know there were light infantry who were on the green, and they were issued the pattern 1769 Shortland musket. Many of these regiments had received them in 1771. That was just the light infantry companies who got them. It has a barrel length of 42 inches, overall length of 58 inches, and an average bore diameter of 78. So you talk to a lot of reenactors, they'll say a British musket is 75 caliber. They're all 75 caliber. Well, we've done a study of 78 original guns in museum collections and private collections, and they're between .76 and .82. And they fire a ball, in the British records they talk about 14 ball per pound, which is .693, so you can see that there's a gap between the ball and the bore itself. That's called windage. They needed that so when you would fire your gun numerous times, there would be powder that would build up inside the barrel. And if you loaded a bore-sized ball, it would jam up in the barrel. So they used a much smaller ball, well, a smaller ball in the bore. Here are a couple of examples. There's the one up here. This was the one that was pulled out of the Merritt Monroe House in 1915 and is in the Lexington History Museums. I have a hard time remembering. It's not Lexington Historical Society, so don't shoot me. In the Lexington History Museums collection, and we were able to study that, weigh the ball, and it is a 70 caliber ball, and you can see it still has the wood embedded in it from the garret rafter of the Merritt Monroe House. The other ball in the calipers below, we wanted to have a sample of British musket balls that had not been fired. And so those were found on a British fort site in the Caribbean that was only used during the American Revolution. So we did a sample of about 12 of those balls. That particular ball weighs 30.4 grams and is consistent with a 69 caliber. But there's also some variation in ball size from all the archaeology projects that we've been doing. We've been making a record of all the what could be British musket balls, what are consistent with British musket balls, and keeping a record of it. So his petitions all state a musket ball which passed by the left of the spine, between his shoulders through the length of his neck, making its way through and most miserably shattering his under jawbone. But the evidence suggests, specifically from what Marshall Spring, his doctor, said, and what John Lucas said, that the ball hit his right shoulder. And if he was standing upright and it hit his right shoulder, it would have gone straight through. It wouldn't have gone up through his neck and gone through his jaw. So it's more than likely that he actually crouched down when he heard the shot go off, and the ball ended up going through to the right of his spine, through his neck, and then came out through his lower jaw. This is more consistent with the wound path described by the doctor's petition as well as the pension records. Here's another one, just giving another angle of the ball going through. So one of the things that we've been doing to collect data is a lot of live fire experimental archaeology studies. So this started when we were doing the Parker's Revenge project. I was working with Dr. Doug Scott, who is a famous conflict archaeologist. And while we were doing Parker's Revenge, he said, wouldn't it be great if we could do some shooting, metal detect all the musket balls, and collect some more data. So we started doing these ballistic studies. We'd shoot, metal detect each ball, bag it, tag it, and we'd record it just like we would on an archaeology project. We were also recording velocity. We had high-speed cameras set up that we rented with a videographer, so we could collect as much data as possible for archaeology projects. So with John Robbins, we were able to acquire this ballistics gelatin bust with bone simulant, and what I didn't know at the time is that it had blood inside the brain cavity. And so we lined it up, that's me lining up the shot, so that we had the shooter, who's another archaeologist, set up. You can see him down below here. We've got high-speed cameras and lights on the bust. And then we put what we thought was going to be a shot that he could never make. And this is over a $500 bust. So this was an expensive shoot for us. We had two of these, actually, but we only needed the one. So we set it up. And again, this is the video that I'm just warning you now. You can see there's a black dot right there. We put a Sharpie mark on there and said, okay, see if you can hit that spot. And he didn't exactly hit it, but as you'll see from the video, he hit just above it. And it came out through his face. It's a horrible video. But it gives us an idea of how badly this man was wounded, and the fact that he even survived is amazing. It's 110 grain powder charge, .69 caliber ball, fired from a British pattern 1756 musket, and when the ball struck the bust, it was 845 feet per second is what the ball was traveling at. So you can see on the upper left, the ball going in, you can see it going out, and then we took a probe and we put it through the wound, which again, this is awful. This is awful. And then we brought it back to my house, and if it wasn't bad enough, we brought it into my kitchen, and we took all the ballistics gelatin off to collect the skull fragments and everything else, to the utter disgust of my wife, with fake blood all over the counters. Yeah, she still, every time I mention this, she still has that same horrified look. But if you look at the skull on this side, you can see all the pieces that were left of his jawbone. It was just an awful wound. And we tried to put it back together again, but we couldn't do it fully because there was just so many missing pieces. So he had all these pieces in his face along with pieces of cloth that would have gone in with the wound. So this guy lived a horrible existence for the rest of his life. It was just horrible. The next person that we're going to talk about is James Hayward of Acton. Most people know the 19th century story of James Hayward, but the first mention of this incident is in this April 25th, 1775 newspaper. And it states Mr. James Howard, obviously they screwed up his name, and one of the regulars discharged their pieces at the same instant, and each killed the other. In the 19th century, all of a sudden there's a story that they had a conversation. You're a dead man and so are you, and they both shoot each other. The British soldier falls dead instantly. But there was nobody there to witness it other than those two. But right after the fight, Rebecca Fiske, who lived in the house, she had taken her father-in-law away to safety. And after the fighting had passed, she came back. And in 1827, she wrote this account that she came back, she found the dead British soldier on her front steps. She found 2 wounded British soldiers in the house, and the third was a young American employing his dying breath in prayer. A bullet had passed through his body, taking off in its course the lower part of his powder horn. The name of this youthful patriot was J. Hayward of Acton. His father came and carried his body home. It now lies in Acton graveyard. So Rebecca was there after he had died, and was the only witness right after the battle to the event. And I knew in the 80s this painting of her existed, and it was sold by Grogan Auctions in Boston. But there was only a grainy black and white photograph in the auction catalog, so we didn't know what it looked like. And about a year and a half ago, it came up for auction, and I got really excited about it, and luckily it went to someone we know. It's at Old Sturbridge Village now. But if you look up in the corner, it's a painting within a painting, and that event was so important in her life that there's James Hayward, and the British soldier fighting in the front yard, allegorical type view. You can see the pump that obviously we're going to see in a minute. The pump looks nothing like that. But that event, again, was so important to her that she had it painted and on her wall. And here's James Hayward's powder horn. It's in the Acton Memorial Library collection. The entrance hole is .70, and it is consistent with being fired from a British musket ball. You can see the horn's a little thinner on this side. The ball went through almost round, a few radiating cracks out. Then you can see how thick it is here. The ball went through, blew out the original wooden plug. This was replaced by a descendant. And went into his body, and it more than likely we figured it carried shards of the horn into his side. So we decided to test that. And then another shot that is going to be incredibly hard to hit with a smoothbore musket. And we asked Jay, the archaeologist, can you hit this powder horn? Well, we'll give it a shot. We only had two powder horns, but he was able to hit the horn, and you can see that ballistics gelatin jump off the block. It's just horrible. We also set up examples of period cloth to see how much of the cloth went into the wound. But it's just a horrible shot. And that was a fairly old horn. If I would do this again, we would have used a little more modern horn, so it would be more consistent with what his was, probably in April 19th, because that horn was from the 19th century. Again, we brought this block back to the house and cut it up in the kitchen, which, again, my wife was not too pleased with. But this is what came out of the wound. So in this case, the ball split in half when it hit the horn. We don't know if that happened to James Hayward, but you can see the cloth fragments, and all these bits of horn came out of that ballistics gelatin. So you can see how horrific that wound was. And even if he had lived, he probably would not have lived long. Sepsis and other things, we don't know what organs were hit, but another incredibly horrible wounding on April 19th. So another cool story that exists with Hayward is I was friends with a direct descendant of his, and he gave me a privately published book which showed the Fiske house in the late 18th to the late 19th to the early 20th century, and it showed the Fiske house. You know, it had a few alterations. The pump, the Hayward pump, so-called Hayward pump, is here. You can see this is the marker that's there today. And there's not many pictures of the Fiske house that survive, so this was really cool to find this. And then this picture's in there also, of the Hayward pump. So I was at my house one day, and a member of the Lexington Minutemen, Mike DeRue, came over, and I was showing him these pictures, and he said, you know what, I think in the Hancock Clark House barn there's a pump in there. I said, all right, let's see if it's the same pump. So I went over there, and on the second tier of the barn, we found the pump and pulled it outside for this photo. And the cool thing about it is that Stacy, when she was at the Historical Society, and Jesse both handled the loan with the Museum of the American Revolution. And it was on display with James Hayward's powder horn for a couple of years, so that people around the world who came and visited could hear this story and see the pump and the horn. Another interesting story, going through documents, I started to find a bunch of things with a guy's name on it. And I knew I had seen the name before. And I went back to Hudson's History of Lexington. And it states several on the foregoing list are known to have been colored men, and some of them slaves, among whom are Samuel Crafts, Pomp Blackman, Jupiter Tree, Prince Esterbrook, Pomp Fiske, Cato Tudor, and John Tingle, perhaps others. Well, John Tingle was not a person of color. John Tingle actually came over on the Somerset. He was a British Marine. And in October of 1774, he's listed in the ship log right here as coming from Wales, and he was 23 years old. So in the Lexington History Museums collection, I got it right, Jesse, is Dr. Joseph Fiske's bill for April 19th, but there's another one that exists. The bill in the Lexington Historical Society lists how many wounded he took care of, but one in the Boston Public Library lists the names of some of the wounded in the regiments that they were in. And John Tingle was wounded on April 19th, and Joseph Fiske took care of him. This is a bill from April 27th to dressing of John Tingle, 7 days at Mr. Buckman, so he was at Buckman Tavern. On June 17th, during the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Committee of Safety sent out word for militia companies to come in and support the troops that were fighting in Cambridge as a backup. And Lexington was one of the companies that was called in, and this is the document that was sent by them to the commanding officer of the militia in the town of Lexington. You are immediately to muster the men under your command and forthwith to march them into Cambridge. So when I was looking at the muster roll for Captain Parker's company, there was my friend John Tingle. His name's spelled differently. There's 2 L's at the end here, but that's definitely him. So not only was he fighting against the provincials on April 19th, he was wounded and taken care of in Lexington, and then ended up joining the Lexington militia, which is really cool. He was there for 2 days in June of 1775. So the town of Lexington wrote this letter. This is another one that I found in the archives, and as I started to read it, obviously it's really hard to read, so I did transcribe it. The selectmen of the town of Lexington, petitioners on behalf of John Tingle of the 3rd Division of Marines of the British service, taken prisoner on the 19th of April, 1775, and in November following, cheerfully and voluntarily entered the Continental service in Captain Abijah Child's company in the regiment commanded by the late Colonel William Bond, and endured all the fatigues and hardships of the campaign in Canada, which so impaired his health that the Honorable General Gates gave him his discharge at Ticonderoga, September 18th, from which place, after many difficulties, he arrived at this town and is now in a poor state of health, without comfortable clothing, but still hearty in the American cause. I love that line. Intending, when his health is restored, to engage again in the Continental Army. All which circumstances your petitioners pray that your honors would take into your wisdom, consideration, and afford him such relief as you shall seem meet, or met, but that's the way. I kept all the original spelling in these things. So on the back of that document, it is said that the selectmen in the town of Lexington are to afford John Tingle, named in the petition, all the necessary relief under his present circumstances and lay their accounts before the general court of this state for an allowance. So they're basically saying that cover his expenses and then give us a bill and we will pay you back for it. So we've got John Tingle, wounded on April 19th as a British soldier. Then he's in Boston with the Lexington militia. Then he's at Ticonderoga and sick. So he comes back to Lexington for help. So in 76, 77, Tingle was in Captain Thomas's company of Colonel Marshall's 10th Massachusetts Regiment, and he appears right up here, I know it's a little bit hard to read on the screen, as receiving his rations. So we know he was in that regiment and during that time period. In February 3rd, 1777, he was re-enlisted by Colonel James Barrett, and you can see him right there. So James Barrett, along with a bunch of other people on this list, some of those people fought on April 19th from Concord and other towns, and a few of those guys died and never returned to their hometowns. But here we have John Tingle again enlisting, and in 1778, he's in, again, Captain Thomas's company of Colonel Marshall's 10th Massachusetts Regiment, and then he's listed as deserted, July 26, 1778. And then on this document, he's also listed as, this is all the dead and deserted people in Captain Thomas's company. There is John Tingle again listed as deserted. So this is the fourth story that I added. And I added this one because I think it's fascinating, and it comes another person who wasn't a patriot, and his story is not known. And I'm working on a new book right now, and this story is going to be in it. I found this newspaper article about 2 years ago, and it says, one Mansfield, a breeches maker in Boston, who went out with the troops in the late engagement, was in the skirmish fired at by the regulars through mistake, they taking him to be one of our men. The ball entered his neck and came out of his mouth. And then this line is great. Wretches like him often meet their just reward. So this guy was a loyalist pilot or guide who came out with Gage's troops to Concord. And then sometime during the retreat, we don't know exactly where, he was shot by friendly fire. He was shot by British troops and killed. Now, I remembered I had seen this once before, and it was from a 19th century book years ago, but there was no other description of who this guy was. So literally, within 2 beers, I found who he was. And it was John Mansfield, who was a leather breeches maker in Boston. And he also was a glover. And this ad in the newspaper from 1772, it mentions that his shop is nearly opposite Dr. Sylvester Gardner's in Marlborough Street in Boston. So I figured this had to be him. I ended up finding a bunch of ads for him which end in February of 1775, mysteriously. Maybe not, maybe not. So then my next place to look is I always look in Google Books. And I found this manuscript written in 1881, and it says, Coolidge Commons married Margaret Mansfield, who was born in Boston, Mass., March 25th, 1775. It was a time of great deprivation and suffering in consequence of the towns being garrisoned by the British troops under General Gage. In less than 1 month, the memorable march to Concord and Lexington took place. John Mansfield, the father of Margaret, was killed at Bunker Hill. So the family changed where he was killed to not be a loyalist. So they put him as being killed at Bunker Hill in the 19th century. And even today, when you search him on the internet, here's John Mansfield, born in 1745 in Ireland. Death, he was 29 years old, killed June 17th, 1775, at Bunker Hill, Suffolk, Massachusetts. So all these things, and Eric, we see this with objects and museums and auctions all the time, where there's a note with something that everybody thinks is true, but it's not. So we know that he actually was killed by British forces on April 19th. But I wanted a little reassurance in that, but I couldn't find it. And then 3 weeks ago, I was at American Antiquarian Society doing some research for the next book. And when I do those, I'm madly photographing documents. You don't really have a chance to read them because you want to get as much as you can in one day. So I'm cranking out photos. And 2 days later, over a beer, I'm reading this document. And it's from Samuel Salisbury. Samuel Salisbury was a merchant in Boston, and his brother, his business partner, was in Worcester. And American Antiquarian has this great pile of letters between the two of them, talking about what they need for materials to sell in both places, and what's going on, current events. And in this one, this is from Samuel to Stephen in Worcester. And it says, yesterday was the most melancholy day that ever I saw. Fellow subjects engage in a bloody battle against each other. The Americans, by the assistance of heaven, drove them down into Charlestown, where I saw them from Beacon Hill engaged. A most terrible sight it was. They are very backward in owning how many men they have lost, and would have it believed it was very few. They say 50, some 70, but I believe the number to be vastly greater. They seem now to be sensible. The Americans will fight. And then it goes on to say this. Our neighbor, Mansfield, is missing and is supposed to be killed fighting against the Americans. So I never expected to see that. I was sitting there like shaking, going, yes, look at this, more evidence on Mansfield. My wife, again, thinking I'm completely insane. I had to tell her about it. She's just looking at me like, whew. I'm like, no, this is really cool. This is really cool. So I think this gives us enough evidence to say that we now know that John Mansfield, leather breeches maker from Boston, went out. But there's one more thing that I found, the ad on the left, which is really cool with this pair of leather breeches. It says, again, that his shop is nearly opposite Dr. Sylvester Gardner's in Marlborough Street, Boston. And the next ad is Samuel and Stephen Salisbury's ad. And they write, their shop at Boston, 2 doors to the southward of Dr. Sylvester Gardner's in Marlborough Street. So they were neighbors. So Samuel Salisbury would have known John Mansfield. And on that note, I'm going to end with the Bullet Strikes book. Doug Scott and I worked on this project for about 5 years, doing all of our ballistic studies and trying to record all the data. We did the Buckman Tavern door, James Hayward's horn, the Elisha Jones house, Jason Russell house, and a bunch more. There's a lot of interesting information, at least I think. We also went through, had ground penetrating radar done of the cemetery in Arlington. We found where the British mass graves were based upon that data, at least areas that are consistent with mass graves. And so we've put together a lot of information in the book, and at least we have one celebrity who enjoys it. Kurt Russell, as most of you know, was here July 3rd, and he was given 2 copies of the book and was in his hotel room that night reading it. And according to his manager, he was FaceTiming with his family and called in the manager and asked for 6 more copies of the book to give to his family. So they made a mad rush for Lexington History Museums, and he ended up with 8 copies of the book, which I thought was pretty cool. But anyway, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to my babble. I find this stuff fascinating, and I hope I didn't bore you guys too much with it, and hopefully you find it interesting too. So, I think
If the lights turned up.
Stacy's going to...
And then if anyone has any questions, I have a mic here, and Jeff over there has a mic.
Were there many others besides John Tingle that were known to have been British soldiers that ended up fighting with the Americans, and is there much?
So it's hard to say on April 19th. There's a list of British prisoners that survived from the prisoners in Concord in December of 1775. And most of them seem to have gone back to the British Army. There were some, obviously, that deserted before April 19th that ended up fighting against the British. But we don't really know. Obviously, there are others that appear later on that deserted at different times. But from April 19th, it's hard to say. John Tingle is the only real one we have a decent amount of information on.
What is garrison duty that you can do with this
So,
job?
good question. So, garrison duty would be, he wouldn't be working too hard. I don't think he would be carrying a musket and doing guard duty, obviously with his arms so bad, but they would put him to work somehow to help with the militia when they were, if they were doing something at a fort or whatever, Castle Island or Castle William, they would be called in to help assist with some kind of work. It was like one of those things where you're not going to get out of doing something. We're going to put you to work. My parents used to do the same thing to me. I don't care if your leg's broken. You're going to help us out. You're going to do something. So I think it was a similar way. They were just, I think they were really tough, I think if it was me, I would have said, yeah, I think you've done enough, You've done enough. Anybody else?
Have you encountered descendants of any of these men?
So, good question. And I see you on Channel 5 every Sunday morning. I watch you. So, Anyway, I'm glad you said something. Yes, so James Hayward, when he was killed, was 25 years old. He was unmarried. He never had children. But his brother, Stevens Hayward, his line keeps going and lives in that. Some of them still live in the Acton area. And they own that horn up until it was donated to the town in around the 1870s. And they're the ones who put the new plug in the back with the silver band, and they engraved a little escutcheon on the plug. So they were proud of that horn. Even now, he would tell me in the 90s, and that was our horn. That was our horn, But so yeah, some of the Hayward family is still around. Tingle, we don't know what happened. He vanishes. Robbins vanishes. So it's really hard. Some of them just go poof. They may have moved away. So.
What about the discrepancy in the divorce laws with Charlottesville and the Best? And did they have to use different?
Yeah. So Charlottesville, if you're talking about, in 1775, they would have been carrying a French 1728, not the 63-68, which most reenactors have today because it's readily available. But the bore size is different. So the bore in a French musket is .69, roughly. It can go up to .72, because again, these barrels, today we bore them. Back then they were made from a flat piece of iron and welded around a mandrel. So they're not all exactly the same. But the French musket would fire a ball of about .63 or .64. So that's how we can identify some of them on the battlefields. But the British musket is a larger bore and a larger ball than the French muskets are.
The story about...
No, you can't ask a question, Paul.
Is that real fire?
Yeah.
The story of the Hayward well,
Yeah.
and I had heard it a little bit before, raises hairs on the back of your head.
Yeah.
The idea that it was just sitting in the barn. And are there any other items like that have similar stories? I'm sure there are, but that you can think of, maybe just one that's kind of like almost lost to us, except they found it over here.
One, yes. And surprisingly, it happens quite a bit. There are things that, I was asking Stacy when she was at Lexington History Museums about, hey, do you have any other bullet-struck objects? Because we had done the William Monroe 1747 dying father, and we had studied that musket shot in the painting. But then I had found a newspaper article from 1871 talking about Reverend Stetson, who lived in Buckman Tavern, and that there was a bullet hole in the clapboards. And I reached out to Stacy and I was like, do you have anything else? And she gets right back to me going, oh yeah, we have a clapboard, with a bullet strike in it. Today, I was in there with Jesse and I saw something I had never seen before that I have some information on. I'm like, well, wait a minute, what is that? And like, you never showed me this before? And she's looking at me like I'm crazy. I know I am, but still, yeah, there are all these things that appear. I find them sometimes at Antiques Roadshow when they pop up to the table. It's like something amazing pops up that you would never expect would survive, And surprisingly, it happens a lot. One of the great things about New England is this is like America's attic. Frugal Yankees saved a lot of crap. And a lot of cool crap sometimes too, So there are things that pop up all the time.
It's still out there.
It's what keeps it exciting. There's always something new to learn and there's always something new to find. And that's what's so exhilarating about studying this stuff.
I have two questions. The first one, I'm wondering where you just happened to come up with two forensic busts. Do you write for funding, or do you just find them in a dumpster? The second question is, what fabrics, when you put the fabrics behind the powder horn, what fabrics did you use?
Okay, those are two great questions. So the busts that we use and the ballistics gelatin that we use, it's what the FBI use for ballistics testing. What we used in our studies is modern shooting incident reconstruction, adapting it to a historical context. So we contacted Dr. Scott works in forensics, and he reached out to the company that makes the busts for the FBI, and we bought two of them from them. Now, what was the other question again? The cloth, yeah. So what we did is we took some 6x6 squares of Cochin and Phillips broadcloth of different weaves. Then we'd have a piece of serge for lining, a waistcoat made from broadcloth, serge for lining, and then a piece of linen shirt. And that's what we shot through. One of the other tests we did is there have been musket balls that were found on battlefields near hospital sites with a cloth imprint in it. And one of the things we wanted to test also in our ballistic studies was, can you pick that up on the lead? And we fired at the ballistics gelatin through different grades, superfine, mid-grade, and common broadcloths, and you can see each distinct weave on the soft lead ball. So, not that that was part of your question, but I had to throw that in too. You got the bonus.
Is it really the case that every piece of weaponry used in this war was handmade? How much were the machines and all involved?
Yeah, so they did use some machines for boring the guns, but for the most part, all of those barrels are all made the same way. So all those muskets you look at in the Lexington History Museums, I didn't get the look this time, or here, or Colonial Williamsburg, the barrels are all made the same way. You know, and each gun, as Eric can tell you on the British muskets, each gun, the parts are numbered by the builder so that they have assembly marks so they can fit each gun, or each part into each gun. So yeah, it's amazing. And watching people make some of the barrels and things, it's incredible. That's why guns were so in demand in 1774 and 75. And even when they couldn't get them in here, they were taking older guns and using the barrels and locks and stocking these guns, because making the barrels and the locks was a pain. You know, it was time consuming. So a lot of builders, even before the blockade, when they would get locks and barrels shipped into Boston, and they'd buy the parts and build a gun. So, you know, that John Cookson gun, John Monroe's musket at Lexington History Museums, that gun was made with an English barrel, an English lock, but it was built by John Cookson in Boston. So, you know, he was importing, he could make all those parts, but it was cheaper sometimes just to take the imported stuff and put it on the gun.
You had a lot of copies of the petitions of John Robbins.
Yeah.
So starting in 1776, why did he have to keep doing that? Did he have to keep? Why didn't it? If you get a pension, usually that's it. Were they increasing it?
But no, this was a time. This was all new. You remember, this isn't like today where, oh, you get a pension and you automatically get that payment. This was all new. You know, yeah, they had given pensions for soldiers during the French and Indian War and stuff like that, but you had to put in for it every year to get your pension. Yeah. So he had to write that every year to get his yearly allotment.
I'm interested in the British mass grave. Like,
Yeah.
what did you see on LiDAR?
So we didn't use LiDAR on that one. We didn't use LiDAR on that. We've used LiDAR on a lot of sites. We just did a project at Elmbrook Hill in Lincoln. So it was Bloody Angle before, but it's Elmbrook Hill now. We used really great new LiDAR on that. The data hasn't been released yet. Hopefully soon enough, the Park Service will give the information that we found there. But in Arlington, there's a company that makes the equipment, GSSI. And when we were doing the Jason Russell House study, one of the things we wanted to know is, was the Jason Russell House ever moved? And we reached out to GSSI. And while they don't necessarily do ground penetrating radar projects, you have to get an archaeologist to do it. They have an archaeologist on staff that tests all of the equipment. And they gave us pro bono the work at Jason Russell House. And they also did the cemetery. And we had an idea of where the mass graves were. Samuel Abbott Smith wrote in 1864 where by the fence there was a brook, and he basically said where the British were buried in the slave section. So he went in and did the ground penetrating radar, and we didn't hear anything for a while. And I was at an archaeology conference in Philadelphia, and GSSI was set up there, and I see Peter, the guy who did the work, and he's like, come here, you got to see this data. And we went over and looked at his computer, and sure enough, you could see the depressions where there was 2 mass graves. So there were the guys the British soldiers who were killed that were buried on April 20th, because we know a party went out from Cambridge and buried the British along the road. But we also knew that there were a bunch of mortally wounded British soldiers who died there that were buried later. So we could see the 2 graves, and the other great part about that is you could also see the individual graves of the enslaved there. So Arlington was able to put a marker out for the enslaved and for the British soldiers based upon the data that was found. So it was cool stuff, you know, using modern research that, You know, they didn't have, you know, we can do all this ballistics testing, we can metal detect the musket balls, we can use GPR and LiDAR and all this great stuff that people haven't had before. So there's so much more we can learn.
Any other questions? All right, some good questions from the audience, thank you. So Joel is going to stick around for a little bit. He has some of the last copies of the first run.
Yeah, the first printing of the book is sold out. I have the last few copies, and then we've got another printing that's coming in soon, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So I do have some copies here. If you have any other questions, just come on up and talk. Obviously, I like to talk about this stuff. So,
Do you have a website?
I am building a website right now, so it isn't completely built yet, but like when I'm doing a talk, I spend so much time looking at it and redoing it, and I'm doing the same thing with a website. At some point, I just got to say, put it up.
So we appreciate you all coming tonight. This was a really great evening. I personally really enjoyed it since I used to work at Lexington History Museums.
You were a big help in this work.
But it's always great to see Joel, listen to his research. It's great to see everyone here is able to make it tonight. As Rich has mentioned, we have some great events going on for our anniversary year. One of the next events that's probably of interest to this group is Tuesday, December 2nd. The Grand Lodge of Masons in Massachusetts have actually created a replica cannon similar to the ones that were moved by the Henry Knox expedition in 1775 to 1776. And they're going to be bringing that cannon here at 4:45 p.m. On December 2nd. We'll have a program outdoors for about half an hour if anyone's interested in coming to that. We also have a flyer on the table outside the door with some of our other upcoming programs in the back. So if you stay for book signing, chatting with Joel, whatever, you're welcome to stay. And if you're heading out, then we appreciate you coming and thank you so much.